Thanks everybody for coming. I'm Aslak the Awful, and today we are going to be talking about the almost complete history of magic. This will be starting in about the 1600 before Common Era and going through 1600 Common Era. A little bit of leeway back and forth. So we're going to start out with the Westcar Papyrus. This is one of those where it is one of the only stories that I'm going to talk about. This wasn't an actual event that happened for real, but it definitely has some elements that we recognize as magicians. This actually talks about Dedi was a magician invited into the pharaoh's palace and performed some tricks. Specifically, the ones that were mentioned is he took a goose and he took the goose's head off, threw it across the court, set the goose down, the head came back and the goose got up and ran around. And then he did it. There was another bird. They didn't identify what kind of a bird, but it was another large bird that they did that with. And then the pharaoh asked him to do it with one of his slaves, and Dedi refused, so that he would not do such things on the noble herd. But then they brought in a bull, and he did the same illusion on a bull, which is impressive if you've actually. This is actually a trick that magicians still do to this day. And thinking of the materials they had back then, it is actually possible this is based on a real illusion. A magician actually did this for somebody, and then it got embellished and moved up. I'm not sure how they pull it off with the bull, but usually it's done with doves. So this is kind of where the first time magic was really written about. So we've got kind of solid information about magicians. There was other magicians in this story doing other tricks. One of the myths is that this is when cups and balls came in, but cups and balls is not mentioned here. There's also a tomb that people like to say has cups and balls, and that again is probably not the case. Though, fun enough, there are jugglers in that tomb, different types of variety acts, but cups and balls does not come in. I mention that because it is my favorite trick, so we'll be talking a bit about that through this lecture. So this is 1600 BCE. Just so you know, on the dates, usually there's a date range. I put just kind of the middle of that date range on all of this. Most of these, up until you get into the 15th, 16th century, is a range. I just kind of put a single date in there for you. Next, we talk about magic wands. This is kind of the next time magic shows up in writing that I found. We're going to see a lot of big gaps just because we've got a lot of knowledge missing in writing. And I like going more towards what really happened, what we know is going on, rather than speculation. I bring this one, again, it's another story, but now we know that magicians are associated with wands at this point. This is Homer and his Odyssey. Wands are mentioned, 3 different types of wands and the powers associated with them. There's Hermes is the wand we see here. So they brought in magician magic being associated with the wands rather than rods or staves. This was specifically a smaller device. It's often believed that the black and white wand, so the black wand with the white tips, is associated commonly with, get the name right, Jean-Eugène Robert Houdin. But I found that's turn of the 19th century, but I found in 1902 this illustration in Hieronymus Bosch's The Conjurer. It's not exactly black and white, but you can see where the stylization's is already coming in. So magicians are getting very stylized wands very early in their history. Next is a very classic illusion called the linking rings. This one goes very far back. This is the Han Dynasty in China. This is the first time it's mentioned. I will read the names so I can get this. Zhao Weiyun, in a letter to her husband Sima, talked about the 9 linking rings, which they don't give an exact description of what was going on. The thing that I found interesting about this, and this is done in poetry form, but she was talking about the 9 linking rings, which is what a lot of magicians still use today, is we use a 9-ring form. The picture on the right that's extremely blurry, that really was the best one I could possibly find. The original book I found it in was even worse than this picture, but on the gentleman in the center, you can see in his left hand there some circles, and those were variety performers in that area. So it could be the first indication of linking rings being drawn. It could be another performance art, but we know during that time period, that was in the 1200s, linking rings were already fairly popular in China. Again, in 2 BCE, and then in 250 Common Era, we have examples of rings in some museums that look suspiciously like things, but they don't know exactly what they were being used for yet. So it's kind of a speculation with the magicians of like, oh, was that an example of linking rings in a museum? So one of the older magic tricks. Excuse me. Next, we move to 1 Common Era, and the Greek temples like to use magic quite a bit. Some of the techniques that magicians have used for centuries were being used here to talk about, to show that the gods were real. So they would have doors that would open on their own, or that you could hear the god's voice from different parts of the room, and you wouldn't know where it was coming from, and there was somebody in the control room back behind controlling how the fire was coming up and how the doors were going to open and where the voices were coming from. They'd also have where you could seal the temple. They could find no doors in or out of the temple and seal it, and the offerings would disappear. So, which of course was the priest's secret trap doors, pulling the offerings and then using it for themselves. So this is another thing. Magicians were not always just entertainment. A lot of these magic things were used for the religious, and then not all of them were saying, this really was the gods. It was just kind of a way to bring you into the experience. The passion plays were done where you'd see people ascending to heaven, and they would use a lot of the same systems that magicians use to fly nowadays. Very similar. It was rudimentary comparatively, but they would have people float up and you couldn't see the device that was making them fly. And nobody was thinking this person really is going to heaven. They know it was an act and a play, but it brought them more into the moment. So that's a lot of what magicians do, is they like to bring people into those moments, whatever moment they're trying to create. Now we start in with my favorite. This is our first example of the cups and the balls showing up. 65 Common Era. This was Seneca the Younger in a letter was talking. It was just kind of a brief thing mentioning that it was as deceptive as it was kind of more written like it was a con man. They weren't, maybe not a con man, but a trickster. It was deceptive as a trickster with his bowls and his pebbles. So it's a really brief mention. But I mean, how many tricksters have used bowls and pebbles? And then later, as we know, it developed into cups and balls type performances, especially once we get to Greece 250 years later. A very, very good example. I'm going to butcher his name again. Alciphron of Athens. He does a very detailed description of a cups and balls performance using white pebbles and 3 cups, inverted cups, and how the pebbles moved between the cups and then they disappeared. And then they started appearing in spectators' noses and in their ears, if you think your uncle's quarter behind the ear. And then they vanished again. He started juggling them and they started vanishing. So we now have the cups and balls being done for possibly nefarious purposes, but definitely for entertainment purposes. People enjoying the entertainment. This is one of my favorites, the Inexhaustible Vase. This one's, I put this in there. This was actually not in Europe. This was over in Colombia. And this was a jar from carbon dated about 1290 is when they think it was fired. But it was given to an archaeologist who put it on a shelf in the 1950s. And the example he had was broken. So it wasn't museum quality. It was one of those that the archaeologist took home. And his magician friend was there in his living room and looking at it and told him, well, that's a magic trick. And he says, what? And he got looking at it and explained how this worked. And it's the same method that magicians are still using today. So they had no idea what these little vessels were being used for or why they were so designed until you end up with a cross discipline. A magician just so happens to see one and reveals, oh, well, this is what this is and what's going on. So they're still speculating as to why they were using it. You know, was it a religious thing? Was it an entertainment thing? Was it something else? There's not a ton of things you can use them for, but something so specialized. I just think that's just a fun story how magicians kind of, it's like, oh, did you know? Which comes into one of the problems with my research. You know, I find references in archaeological digs to 3 nested cups. Well, that could just be somebody putting their cups together to transport them. Or it could be the 3 nested cup of a magician. But then magicians also used 4 cups or 2 cups or 1 cup. So how do you know what that cup was used for unless you were back there? So I always find it interesting to go through archaeological information and see when you're finding nested cups and see what else was found with them. I'm sure there's other finds like that where a magician's going to look at it and say, wait a minute, I know what that is. So, the Inexhaustible Vase. This is a book. Secretum Philosophorum is one that I don't see mentioned by magicians a lot. It was written in 1325 in Latin. And it's got more stuff like, I bet you can't do this type info. But it does have some magic tricks in there. And some of those tricks were repeated ad nauseum through history, at least through the time period we're going to talk about. In particular, there's a trick in here getting an apple to move across the table that's repeated in at least 4 books that I know of in the time period. So people reading this and repeating it, you get a lot of that, especially with one of the books we'll talk later. It was just 150 years, people kept reprinting the same information, maybe dressing it up a little, adding 1 or 2 things in. But the magicians just kind of kept passing this information down through the ages. Some of the stuff that was in this one that was actual magic tricks, one that I quite liked was you can turn water into wine. There was a cut and restored rush, which is a type of grass, which I thought was interesting because that's the origins of our cut and restored rope that magicians like to do. And then they had a rope escape. The magician would have his hands tied behind his back and be able to get out of them no matter how tightly they pulled the cords, which ends up being one of the more famous tricks as we go through history to Houdini. And then one of my favorite ones that, of course, we would never even think about, but you could set somebody's face on fire and they would be unharmed. And it turns out it's a powder that they would blow in somebody's face that would light on fire because it would pass through a candle, but it wasn't hot enough to scald. But, oh, the lawsuits on that. So Interesting stuff that they had come up with back then. Next, we have playing cards. So playing cards are way earlier than a lot of people think. In 1364, there was a big ordinance talking about games, and it was talking about what kind of games are not allowed. The main problem was that the peasants were not working their fields. They were start restricting when games could be played or what types of games could be played. So in 1364, they declared, dice games are not allowed, these board games are not allowed. The cards weren't mentioned. Then by 1376, there was a new game called Naib, and it was forbidden. The implication was that it had recently been introduced. So in that short period, we have cards were never mentioned, and then suddenly cards were mentioned. The cards, these right here that we're seeing on our screen are a set of French cards. The hearts, spades, clubs, and diamonds were French symbols. Every country kind of had its own set. For example, Italy and Spain were sword, cup, coin, and club. Germany had acorn, leaves, hearts, and bells. They actually had other types of ones. Like I have a deck here of German cards that is jars, cups, ink stamps, and books. So there's other ones that were game themed. So it had like deer and hawks. So there's definitely some variation going through. Another thing that's a misconception is that indexes were not a thing in the medieval times where you'd only have to count the pips and there were no numbers. But I actually have at least one German deck that has, or I think I have two German decks that have the numbers actually printed right on it. So you don't have to count the pips, you can just look at the number at the top. So cards, these types of cards that we're seeing here were very little changed for the next couple of 100 years. Civil War cards look very similar to these ones still. The changes were minor. So it's a nice tip if you're looking for playing cards to use at a medieval event. Look for the Civil War ones because they're a little more durable and they look pretty much identical. Next, we'll talk books on magic started being printed a little bit more often. Again, gonna butcher these names. The Vibris Quantitatis. That's actually called On the Power of Numbers. This was a book on mathematics that ended up having math tricks and numerical puzzles in it. A Franciscan monk actually wrote this. The fun part is that this book, he also was talking a lot about the person he was working with, Leonardo da Vinci. So we know that magic was being done at least near da Vinci while he was working. Whether or not he was a participant, I haven't been able to read this book, so I don't know all of the interaction yet. This is mostly what I get from the descriptions of the book. And then a few years later, we have the Brief and Pleasant Treatise by Thomas Hill. That's him, which I bring in because it is the first English book with magic in it. Some of the tricks in that one was turning red flowers into white flowers, so it bleeds the color out of them, and making bread jump off the table. Which I thought that would be fun until you wanted the bread. So we're starting to get more books printed with magic in them. And this is really where at least the medieval Renaissance magic starts blossoming. We have a bunch of magicians that start being named. We start finding out who they are or what they did. So for example, Italian magician, he performed at sea. The description's really good where he pulled out 3 copper cups and a little ball and then started making the ball disappear, reappear, move from cup to cup, and multiply. which anybody that likes magic knows that's the cups and balls. It was just the right description. You're like, oh, you know, copper cups, that's actually my primary set. We still use copper. And then he also was making things disappear and reappear in people's pockets. The description kind of might get fanciful or not, I don't know, but like at one point he had like a comb and a pen and a mirror all coming into this one guy's pocket, and a cork from a wine bottle. Just was either loaded that poor guy down or just was really good at his sleight of hand. Damatus, the Spanish magician, this is the first time we have the linking rings. The description on this one is that he took some unlinked rings and he threw them in the air, and when they came down, they were linked. That is a move that I do when I do linking rings. So I know a lot of magicians that use that move. So we're now into whether he did the full performance of linking rings as you'd see nowadays is unsure, but we do know that the linking rings are now a thing. People are paying attention to it, not only in China, but in Europe. We have Redius, the Italian magician. He was jailed for satanic-inspired card tricks. They actually tortured him until he told them how he did the tricks. They were not going to let him go until they were sure that he was just being a trickster and not actually in league with darker powers. So even in the 1500s, they were still going after magicians. A lot of why we don't have information on magic earlier is because it was dangerous to say you had magic. So it didn't get recorded a lot when it was performed. One of my favorites is Mr. Scotto, the Italian diplomat for the Holy Roman Emperor. He was a knight, and he was at a dinner party entertaining Archduke Ferdinand, and a doctor was observing it and wrote down everything he could remember about what happened. And so he got a really good description of essentially a dinner party magician sitting there entertaining the guests around him. This was how he would get people to sign on to their treaties, is he would go meet with them, have dinner, and then just a charming gentleman and entertain them and do this magic for them. And then by the next morning, they were best friends. And of course, they were going to help, you know, much more favorable treaties, much more amenable to whatever the emperor was looking for, the Roman emperor was looking for. So some of the things he did, which is still, some of these are things that we do today, was that he just told them to think of a card. And then he would pull that card out of the deck and show them which card it was. He did one where he had them write down any word they wanted on a piece of paper, and he wrote, and then when they both turned, or he left the room and wrote, and when he came back, their papers matched. So a writing duplication. He had one where people were, you know, they'd call for a card, so the nines, and he'd pull out, and he'd turn his cards over, and he had 4 nines, and then they'd ask for the 5s. You know, he'd pick up other cards, and they'd say 5s. He'd flip them over, and it was the 4 5s. And one joker said nothing, and when he flipped his cards over, they were blank. So good magician, because, you know, you got to be ready for that kind of stuff. And then he did another one that we would call a book test, where the person could pick any word out of a book, and then he would be able to tell them what this word was. The picture we have on this page is Scotto. This was a medallion stamped of him. Let's see, we also have Abram, another Italian. There's a lot of magic in Italy, at least a lot of the recorded stuff. He actually was a court engineer. This guy, to meet him would have been brilliant. This guy's got to be brilliant. He invented a collapsible boat. He invented the extension ladder. And he invented a rapid-firing gun, of all things. So, I mean, just the genius behind some of the stuff that he did. This was very, very smart man. And us magicians get to thank him. This was the first recorded rising card. So he would have a deck of cards, and the chosen card would rise out of the deck. There's at least 400 different ways of doing that right now that I've seen documented. And then when they asked him, they said, well, how did you do that? And the only thing, it was a priest that was asking him, and he told him the only thing he could tell him was that he didn't deal with demons to do it, that it was pure trickery. So he assured the guy, but he refused flatly, even the simplest trick he did, to tell anybody how it's done. So magicians still hold to that. At least most of us do. And then Francisco Soma, an Italian aristocrat, the one that he was recorded doing, we would know as an ambitious card. They would choose a card, and no matter what they did, the card ended up either in a specific place or on the top of the deck every time. They tried to do, they'd try and move the card around or get rid of it, and it kept coming back. So that's a lot of the stuff that was going on during this time period. So we're starting to get a lot more descriptions, a lot more entertainment. There's still suspicion that magicians are in league with something, but much, much less. Scoto, the only time he was ever accused of witchcraft, it was a lady that had said he'd bewitched her and took advantage of her, and that's why she was found in bed with another guy. He wasn't even in the country. So 1584. People talk about the golden age of magic. In my opinion, this is it. In 1584, 2 books were written: The Discovery of Witchcraft and Clever and Pleasant Inventions. Discovery of Witchcraft ends up being the book that magicians rip off for at least 150 years. And The Clever and Pleasant Inventions is kind of the first dedicated book on magic. So Discovery of Witchcraft, written by Reginald Scott. He was a barrister in England. He was actually writing about how witches weren't a thing. Anytime you saw somebody that was like accused of witchcraft, either they were swindlers, they were crazy, or they were sleight of hand artists. And so he wrote a whole book on it. In about 22, 28, I can't remember pages of this book, he goes through magicians and their techniques. Some of it's accurate, some of it is impossible. There's no way it could have been done like that. So he clearly wasn't a magician. They think he was consulting with one. No proof that I've seen on it. I haven't researched that story yet. But a lot of what he did, if he didn't have a magician helping him, this guy was very clever and figured out a lot of the methods. And so he goes through and talks about, well, this is how they do these different things. And sometimes it's very brief, and other times he gets pretty involved telling you how it all works. The Clever and Pleasant Inventions, it was in France, written by Provost. And it was an interesting book. It's got a lot of betcha type tricks in there. The thing that I thought was the most interesting is it is the first time he talks about how it was written about how to do moving pictures, how to make pictures move on a wall. So if you like movies, we can go back to 1584. The reason I really love this was because of a man named Percy Diaconus. Because there were 2 books written in the same time period, he actually is a professor of statistics at Stanford. And there's a formula that can look at populations. So if you have a sample of a population, wherever those 2 populations are the same, so let's say you catch 100 fish, let them go catch another 100 fish, however many fish you caught again, you can use a statistical formula to figure out how big the overall population of those fish were. And in this case, he did it for magic. and determined there's around 500 tricks that probably existed during this time. I've documented 381 of them. So we've lost some stuff, but we have a lot of tricks that are still available that we know how, at least what they how, because some of this is descriptions of the effect from an audience point of view. A lot of the times, though, that's all a magician needs to go, got it, because there's at least 5 or 6 methods for all of those. So I really love that we have this great little intersection of 2 books being written in the same year. This is a lot of material that I use comes out of these 2 books. They're both at least had a good variety of things. And yeah, 1584, favorite year. 1593, Most Beautiful Card Games was written. This book was actually written by in Spanish, a Spaniard, and this was about how not to get cheated at the card table. However, if you're during this time period, card games, so if you're to use a magician's trick during the card game, that was basically considered advanced gambling. You weren't cheating as much as you were just a better gambler than other people were. You weren't to be caught because you didn't get to keep that money, but it wasn't as taboo. People still didn't like it, but it wasn't just automatically you're out, forget it. So this was how to not get yourself swindled, which then shows some of the card cheating moves. And then he also throws in some magic tricks because he's like, and to amuse yourself. The one that I think is interesting is they have the 21 card trick in here, which a lot of beginning magicians learn. And a lot of routines get based off of it. Once you kind of get into it and start learning more of it, it can be a fun little, if you do it right, there's some really deceptive ones out there. So now we have a book on just cards. Now we're going a little, depends on what you consider SCA time period, we're going a little outside. So 1612, I bring up the Art of Juggling because this is the first English book that is specifically got, it's aimed more at the magicians. It's also got juggling things in there. It's got some other little tricks. This is actually, most of this book is reprinting of Reginald Scott stuff. There's a couple of things in there that were unique to this one. There's a 3-ball trick in there that was unique to this. And then there's a card trick that wasn't in Reginald Scott stuff that was actually quite inventive. But now we're getting books that are, trying to aim at that audience for the first time with the Art of Juggling. And then our last book we're going to talk about is Hocus Pocus Jr. This book was written by a magician for magicians. This is kind of where this was all culminating to, is how are we going to get this information out to other magicians. You can see on the table there, he's got the cups and balls and some ropes. He had a very good description of cups and balls in there. Some of his stuff was reprints off of Scott, but a lot of this was good information from a magician that was clearly had his craft down, knew what he was doing. This is also where we get Hocus Pocus. There's a lot of speculation as to where they come up with it, how it came to be, but what we do know for sure is that there was a magician named Hocus Pocus, and this is the first time we see this in a written form associated with magic like this. So that is a quick journey through cards. All right,